And we think this is a very timely topic given the recent implementation of the course FTA, the announcement of talks on the Korea-China-Japan trilateral free trade agreement, as well as the negotiations for the Korea-Japan trade agreement, and as well as the continued negotiations of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And one of the goals this morning is to navigate around these various trade agreements and trade frameworks that is taking place in the region, and our speakers will help us do that. So with that said, let me introduce the speakers to you. Our first speaker, Mr. Joshua Meltzer, will discuss Korea's recent trade and economic policies. He's a fellow in the Global Economy and Development Program at the Brookings Institution and an adjunct professor at SAIS, Johns Hopkins University, and Georgetown University Law School. Previously, he was a diplomat in the Australian Embassy in Washington and trade negotiator in Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Our second speaker, Dr. Mireya Solis, will discuss Japan's recent trade and economic policies, and she is the associate professor at the School of International Service at American University. Her research covers comparative and international political economy, comparative studies of regional integration, trade policy, and Japanese politics and foreign economic policy. Our third and last speaker, Dr. Derek Scissors, is arriving a little bit late. He'll be here in time for the second presentation and his presentation portion and the Q&A discussion. But he will discuss the China factor in the two countries, in Korea and Japan's economy and trade frameworks. As a senior research fellow for economics at Heritage Foundation's Asian Studies Center, he focuses on the economies of China and India. He also analyzes and comments on broader economic trends in Asia, as well as related challenges facing the US. He is also an adjunct professor at George Washington University. So with that said, I'll turn the floor over to Mr. Meltzer, who will talk about Korea and Korea's trade and economic policies recently.
Okay, thank you, Sarah, and thank you for the Korea Economic Institute for putting together what I'm sure will be, hopefully, an interesting morning. This is what I'm going to try to talk about in the next 10 or so minutes, which is going to be a bit of an overview of the trade and investment relationship between the United States and Korea, and just provide a sense of the dynamics to that and how that has been changing over time. In the process of talking about that, I think what I hope to make clear is how that has changed, and particularly with respect to China and what that might mean, and we can have a discussion about that hopefully. And then I'll also talk briefly about some of Korea's key trade policies, and particularly its focus on free trade agreements and some of the regional architecture that's happening in the region. So here's just a sense of changes in Korea's exports over the last 30 years or so, and I think the key point that comes out of this graph is that there has been certainly significant export growth as Korea's economy certainly embraced an export-driven growth model. And the other dynamic that comes out of this is a very significantly declining share of exports that have been going to the United States. So we can see in 1980, over 26% of Korea's exports went to the United States, whereas in 2011, that was down to 10%, and the United States was no longer Korea's largest export market. On the import side, there is more or less a similar story. A large growth in imports and a declining share of imports from the United States. So we see that in 1980, over 20% of imports came from the United States, and that is now down to just over 8% last year. So what's been happening? Well, this graph provides a somewhat overview of changes in Korea's trading relationships over the last 5 years with some of its major trading partners. And I think a couple of key things come out of this. And I sort of go over this in the next slide, but I might just talk about this a little bit while you can see the figures up here. But certainly, I think one of the standout factors here, obviously, is a very significant increase in trade with China. And you can see that a 64% increase in exports, a 37% increase in imports. And while trade certainly with the United States has been growing, it's been growing obviously at a significantly slower rate. The other thing to note, I think, here is that Korea has trade surpluses with these countries, whereas it has and continues to have a trade deficit, in particular with Japan. And we'll talk more about Japan later in the panel. But I think one of the interesting things to draw is what is actually happening here, because one of the dynamics that's certainly going on in the region is this sort of disaggregation between countries' economic and security relationships. And so Korea is certainly one of them, where their largest trading partners are not the countries that they necessarily have any particular security relationships with. It's true of Korea, and it's certainly true of other countries. I mean, Australia in the region is another good example. And I think there's sort of some speculation about what this might mean, but the other thing that's certainly happening here, and I think, for instance, this gets picked up in a bit of the Japanese statistics, is that the Japanese trade relationship with Korea is certainly based on a long-standing move of Japanese industry to Korea, and basically the disaggregation of production networks, which is creating a situation where Korea is integrated very intimately into a lot of Japanese large companies' production networks. And I think part of the story here with the changing dynamic between Korea, the United States and China is also a shifting of production networks, and it's a changing role of Korea and China in the production network environment. And so thinking about the trading relationship simply in bilateral terms, I think misses sometimes probably a bigger part of the story. And it's hard to get to this in more detail because the figures, frankly, are just not there in terms of how much of this is goods, a single good moving around different countries and getting produced in different places. But everyone, I think, is familiar with the well-known example now of the Apple iPhone and how that gets recorded as a complete sort of export from China to the United States, whereas only a small component of the value added actually happens in China. And so a lot of these figures are not picking up actually how much of goods are being manufactured in different countries, and I think partly this is what's going on here. So this is just a summary of some of the things I've just said, but I think a couple of things I didn't say here is just the fact that in terms of the United States, Korea is the 7th largest export market and 6th largest source of imports. It's still certainly a very significant trading partner for the United States. The United States obviously remains a very large and important trading partner for Korea, but no longer the number one source of exports or imports. I want to just touch briefly on the investment relationship, because I don't think you can sensibly talk about the trading component without having a look at what's also going on the investment front. And this graph picks up the changes in both the stock and flow of FTI into and out of Korea over the last 10 years. And the key points I want to make here, and these come up on the next slide, but again I might just keep this up for the sake of seeing the figures, is that it's a fairly underdeveloped investment relationship between Korea and the United States, particularly when you look at the size of the trading relationship. So in 2010, United States FDI in Korea's approximately $30 billion, and Korea FDI in the United States approximately $15 billion, which is really a small amount of FDI, and the flows each year are also very, very small. So it's an underdone part of the relationship, and there's a variety of reasons for that. And I'm not going to get into that in too much detail. Suffice to say that the free trade agreement that has now come into effect between the United States and Korea has a lot on investment, both in terms of liberalisation as well as providing rules which should provide investors with greater certainty, predictability, which is anticipated to lead to an increase in the investment relationship of approximately $2 or so billion, but we'll see how that turns out. So I guess this graph here just pulls up the point I was making, and you can see here comparing the flow of trade and the flow of investment, you get a sense of how small the flow of FDI is compared to trade, and really the scope for that to grow. I now will talk briefly about the Fta strategy of Korea. Certainly, Korea was late in coming to free trade agreements. It was very focused on the World Trade Organization, the Doha round, and like a lot of countries, made a decision that there was going to be limited progress on that front, and has adopted a very ambitious Fta strategy, and has actually succeeded to a large extent in that regard. Certainly, it has already completed free trade agreements with the United States and the European Union, two of its largest trading partners, and is looking to negotiate FTAs with a whole bunch of other important trading partners. And I'll bring that up shortly, and I've got a list of the countries it's looking to negotiate with. But certainly, I think from a Korean perspective, there's been a view in the government that FTAs are not only an important driver of market access opportunities, but as well as drivers of domestic reform. I think there's been a view that FTAs stimulate improved efficiency. The competition that's come from them has been seen as being positive for the economy, and so it has not only been essentially a purely mercantilist calculation, though that obviously has been key in terms of trading off market access for market access, but also been seen as a way of driving some important economic reforms in Korea. So here are the FTAs that Korea has already in effect, and you can see the FTAs with the United States and the EU, but also India and some other important blocs, and obviously ASEAN, which I'll talk about briefly towards the end of the presentation. And here are the FTAs currently under negotiation, and again, you can see importantly that there's a bilateral FTA underway negotiation with China, which from a Korean perspective is probably the most significant one. And again, I think this picks up the complex relationship now that exists between Korea and China on the trade front. And this is not only just about finished goods moving back and forth, but it's about the role, the way that Korea and China are now very integrated in terms of production processes, but also important free trade agreements with other countries such as Australia, Canada and Mexico. And these are the free trade agreements under consideration. And again, I probably just want to highlight this possibility of a trilateral free trade agreement between Korea, Japan and China. And this is certainly something that Japan is very focused on. Japan was very much caught, I would say, by surprise at the conclusion of the Korea-EU FTA. And for their sort of electronic industry and automobile industry has been a significant blow because of the preferential access that Korean vehicles and electronic products are going to have into the EU market over the next sort of, I mean, these tariffs are being phased in, but I think for autos, it's going to be almost down to zero in about 5 years. And so, and as I said, there's a very close and dynamic relationship between Japan and Korea from an industry perspective. So, and between Japan and China. So it makes, a lot of sense economically for a trilateral FTA, though I think the barriers are going to be significant, partly because Japan finds it very difficult, frankly, to negotiate deep and meaningful free trade agreements at the moment. I'll just talk now finally about what's going on regionally, and I think one of the key free trade agreements under negotiation at the moment is the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which includes the United States and these 8 other countries. So Korea is not a party to that FTA, but is certainly watching the negotiations closely. The view, I think, here in the United States is that the recently concluded United States-Korea Free Trade Agreement will be the baseline for this TPP, but the TPP will certainly go further than KORUS, and in particular is going to include additional chapters which were not in KORUS, the key ones being state-owned enterprises, regulatory coherence, and a chapter on small and medium-sized enterprises. But this is certainly something that is being discussed in Korea, and I think the expectation is that Korea is probably not going to join the current set of negotiations, but is likely to become a member of the TPP once it gets finalised. The other dynamic in that part of the world is what's happening in the ASEAN Plus context. And as I mentioned, Korea already has an FTA with ASEAN and is commencing trilateral FTA negotiations with Japan and China, which, if finalised, is understood to be a building block for what will be ASEAN Plus 3, which will be ASEAN plus these countries. I mean, Japan, China and Korea already separately have their own FTA with ASEAN. And then there is the so-called ASEAN Plus 6, which extends out to include Australia, New Zealand and India, which countries also have FTAs with ASEAN. And the important, I think, thing to note is what's one of the key dynamics to this regional environment is that it doesn't include the United States, and it's certainly part of what is focusing the current administration on the TPP, which is, in a sense, another regional set of FTAs which the United States is obviously playing a leading role in. I think I'll conclude with that. Thanks.
Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you so much for the invitation to all the sponsoring organizations. So I'm going to talk about Japan's trade policy today. And the argument I'm going to make is that Japan's trade policy is facing a critical juncture. This is a very interesting time to look at what Japan is doing in trade, because there's a lot in the plate, there is a lot at stake, and there's a potential large payoff, but also if things do not work well for Japan, it could actually face marginalization. And I know that marginalization is a strong word, but I think that it actually does reflect some of the worst case scenarios for Japan if some of the initiatives in the plate today do not move forward. So I think that the question that the Japanese government is confronted with today is whether it can actually shift gears away from negotiating numerous small bilateral trade agreements that have yielded only modest results in terms of opening markets abroad with preferential terms of access. And where it can move from these low-yield FTA policy to actually negotiate with its main trading partners the way in which Korea has done. And what that really means, whether Japan can join the big leagues and become a real player in the FTA movement. Because there is increasing concern, to be quite frank, that Japan is lagging behind, that Japan is not assertive enough, that Japan cannot negotiate deep agreements, as we heard before from Mr. Meltzer, and that obviously puts Japan at a disadvantage. So let me then talk a little bit Okay, so I have only 15 minutes, so I have to be brief. So let me just highlight what I intend to do today. How am I going to get at these questions as to whether Japan can shift gears and actually become much more ambitious in its trade strategy? The first point that I want to discuss is why are we at this point today where Japan has a decade of negotiating trade agreements and the results are so modest? What have been the constraints? What has prevented Japan from being more assertive, more forceful in the way in which it negotiates its free trade agreements? In terms of negotiating agreements that cover large amounts of trade, in terms of having its own model of free trade agreement disseminate, travel in Asia, become the standard by which these countries look at what trade and investment integration should be about. And why the quality itself of Japanese trade agreements leaves much to be desired. Not in the rules area. I'm going to highlight later how Japan is actually very ambitious in the rules area, but in terms of market access. And obviously, the elephant in the room here, everybody knows agriculture. Why it's so difficult to get at the bottom of agricultural liberalization. That's my first point. Then after I bring you up to speed on what has been the first decade of Japanese FTA policy, I want to talk about what is a key policy question for Japan today. And that is quite simply whether it can join the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. What is at stake in these negotiations? And I'm going to argue that there's a lot for Japan to accomplish with this TPP, and I'll go through the many different considerations as to why Japan thinks it's a critical initiative. And last, I'm going to talk about what is the interconnection between the TPP and Japan's own regional diplomacy. And my main point is that these are highly connected. What happens in the TPP front is going to have large implications as to with what kind of influence, leverage, Japan can advance its own regional economic diplomacy. So what I'm telling you is that if Japan wants to gain traction in its regional diplomacy, having the TPP card will make that easier. And I'll explain to you why I believe that is the case. Okay, so let me start peeling the onion as to why it has been so difficult for Japan to gain traction in its FTA policy. And I think that the first consideration should be that the so-called Japanese FTA, free trade agreement model, has not been, quite frankly, that appealing to many countries in the region. And there's actually quite a bit of competition. It is a crowded field, if you will, because China has its own style of negotiating free trade agreements, and now the United States is bringing its own vision as to what should be the nature of the integration process. So what is this Japanese vision, and why it doesn't gain traction? First of all, in terms of the contents, in terms of what Japan would like these agreements to be about, the Japanese government is very ambitious in the rules area. It would like to incorporate many WTO plus commitments in areas such as intellectual property, investment, services, government procurement. So it's a loaded negotiation agenda in terms of rules. Another key distinctive trait of Japanese trade agreements is that when it negotiates with developing countries, it incorporates an economic cooperation chapter. So much so that the Japanese government has coined its own term to refer to its own trade agreements, economic partnership agreements. And these are important chapters, if you will, because they do address the aspect of trade facilitation, which on the ground does make a difference. But I want to highlight that these are not binding commitments on the Japanese side. These are just promises of cooperation to help nurture human capital, to promote small and medium-sized enterprises in the counterpart nation. So when you think of the rules area and when you think about the economic cooperation chapter, I think those are the strong suits of the Japanese FTA model. But where Japan comes short, of course, is that it cannot offer substantial agricultural liberalization, and that so far has not been interested when it negotiates with Southeast Asian countries to talk about bringing foreign workers into Japan. So this is in terms of the content, and in terms of the scope, Japan has actually thought of a more inclusive trade grouping. That is, it wants to incorporate not just Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia proper, but also wants to bring in the ASEAN plus 6 framework, as you heard before, other countries such as India, Australia, and New Zealand. So this is what Japan has brought to the table. This is the vision for integration in the region. And it has found, unfortunately, that there are not a lot of buyers and a lot of takers. It doesn't really gain traction. Why? I don't think it's too hard to see why. The main issues of interest for many developing countries in the region, that is agricultural liberalization and the issue of foreign workers, are off limits. They're not going to be part of this agreement. Also, the Economic Cooperation Chapter, as I said before, does not really include any binding commitments. So again, many of these countries have withheld concessions because they don't feel that they're getting a lot back from Japan. It's also important to note, as I said before, that Japan is competing with other countries, and particularly with China. And I think it's fair to say that China has made greater strides in its regional trade diplomacy than Japan has. China has come to ASEAN with the early harvest program, made agricultural concessions, and also, very importantly, I think there's greater convergence of views between China and ASEAN regarding what should be the content of these trade agreements. So they're aiming for perhaps less comprehensive agreements in the rules area, less legalistic agreements, and Japan finds itself as the odd man out in Asia. And this obviously makes Japan's policy lose traction. And I think that the really eye-opener for Japan came when it negotiated the ASEAN-wide trade agreement. And in the rules area, very much came empty-handed. When you look at some of the key chapters, for example, investment, what you find there is a very short chapter, basically 1 or 2 paragraphs saying that the parties have agreed to establish a committee that will continue to review these issues in the future. Basically, no commitments. And this therefore has worried Japan that it cannot push for the kind of integration that it would like in the region. Now, when Japan looks at its other neighbor in Northeast Asia, Korea, it clearly is lagging behind. You already heard from Mr. Meltzer how ambitious, how assertive Korea has been in negotiating trade agreements. And this is a graph that many Japanese trade officials have very much in the back of their mind. They're very aware of this. What this graph shows you is what is the value of trade of each country that is now covered through these free trade agreements. And you can see that Japan is a country that comes last. Think about how problematic it is that you invest all these bureaucratic resources, all the political capital that it takes to negotiate 13 trade agreements, which is are the ones that Japan now has in force, 13 trade agreements, 10 years or more of negotiations, and you cover 18% of the country's value of trade. These obviously contrast with what China has done, the European has accomplished, but more especially South Korea, with 36% of the value of its trade covered by these trade agreements. Let me just catch up here. There is one more reason for concern for Japanese trade negotiators. So what I'm telling you is that these trade agreements have not yet covered large volumes of trade, that the Japanese model in East Asia has not gained traction, but when we also have to look at the quality of these agreements. And here, unfortunately, I have to say that the Japanese trade agreements have come short in the market access area. In terms, if we look at the liberalization ratio, what this table shows you is in 10 years down the road, when an agreement comes into effect, 10 years down the road, what is the percentage of tariff lines that are going to be liberalized to zero, that are going to be eliminated, right? And there is an understanding among trade negotiators that there is a WTO standard and that they should aim to liberalize, to eliminate tariffs, 90% of tariffs, 10 years after enactment. And this is what this dotted line there shows. And I think that it's really worrisome when you look at every single Japanese free trade agreement is below the line. That is a big reason for concern. Korea, actually, I put it there for purpose of a comparison, Korea is above that line. And this is something, this information actually was given to me by Japanese bureaucrats, because they're very aware of this. They would like Japan to be on top of that line. And what they're now trying to strategize is, how can we get there? They're very aware of this, and this is seen as a major constraint. Why is Japan below the line? It's very simple. There is a block of tariff lines that are untouchable, that are not subject to liberalization, and that therefore result in Japan not being able to break that threshold. And I'm talking about agricultural lines. In every single Japanese FTA, there are 400 agricultural tariff lines that are set aside as exclusions, and 320 lines that are usually postponed for negotiation later down the road. So no real commitments. And this has been the bottleneck, if you will, for Japanese trade policy, because it means that Japan cannot easily negotiate with its main trading partners who are large agricultural exporters, and that even when it negotiates with smaller trading partners, it cannot cross that threshold. And this is then how we come to the current juncture, where the Japanese government is very aware that it needs to catch up with what other countries are doing, that it needs to increase the quality of its agreements, and it would like to have a say in the new batch of rules that are negotiated through these free trade agreements. And this is the juncture where the TPP has become a key initiative for Japan. Whether it can join or not the TPP has generated tremendous amount of debate in Japan. Before I go and talk a little bit about what is at stake for Japan in the TPP, let me just say a word as to why the TPP on its own generates so much discussion, why it has gathered so much attention. When you know that there are 400 or more trade agreements out there in the world, you have to wonder why this one in particular gets so much discussion. So this is a trade agreement currently under negotiation by nine APEC economies, including the United States, with 3 countries that have now expressed a desire to also come in. That is Mexico, Canada, and Japan. Now, what makes the TPP stand out is that it promises to do what no other trade agreement has done: to have no tolerance for the exclusion of sensitive sectors, and to systematically tackle non-tariff barriers. Now, because we know that the exclusion of sensitive sectors has always been the cardinal sin of free trade agreements, and because we know that non-tariff barriers are the most formidable obstacles to keep markets sheltered, when you have an agreement that promises to tackle those issues head-on, well, then you have an interesting proposition out there. There's one more aspect of the TPP that makes it very interesting, that also sets it apart from other trade agreements, and that is that it has an open accession clause. So the idea is that this is an initiative that can grow. In fact, the TPP's success is predicated on its expansion. For a TPP to flourish, it needs to go beyond the configuration, the current configuration of 9 members. Now, we don't know, to be also quite honest, we don't know if this rhetoric of high levels of ambition of liberalization that the TPP has put forward will actually materialize. These are ongoing negotiations, and it may be that the TPP does not deliver everything that it promised to do. But it already started with a different premise for the negotiations, and that's why it is so interesting. And there's actually some interesting work out there by people who follow very closely the TPP negotiations on the market access area, and they're not that optimistic about whether this pure level of realization can be maintained. We have to be aware that the predecessor of the TPP, the P4 agreement that really accomplished substantial amounts of liberalization, was an agreement among 4 small, very open economies. When you go from 4 to 9, something may have to be sacrificed. And if you go from 9 to 21, then something more may have to give. So this is an open question, but this is the game in town. This is what Japan is now looking at very, very intensely. Why is that? What is at stake in Japan in coming to the TPP? I think that the stakes could not be higher. I'm going to highlight 3 elements that I think make a very strong case as to why Japan should join the TPP. First of all, because I think it's important for Japan to dispel this gloom that had set in that Japan cannot negotiate substantial trade agreements. Japan needs to be a player in this FTA game. This is basically a race. Countries are negotiating right and left. And if you're seen as a country that cannot commit, then you're going to be left out of the game. And this could be at a serious cost to Japanese industry. And this is the second reason that I bring forward. That because other countries have moved much faster in negotiating trade agreements, there is concern in the Japanese business community that they're going to be at a disadvantage. In business circles, you hear now talk about the 6 woes, 6 things that are compromising the future of Japanese manufacturing in the homeland. And among these 6 factors, obviously yen appreciation, energy uncertainty, things of this nature, but one of the factors that the business community always brings up is this delay in negotiating trade agreements of substance. And the last point, and this ties really nicely with what Mr. Meltzer was discussing here before me, is that Japanese trade bureaucrats also from the get-go have always thought of these free trade agreements not only for their value in securing market access abroad, but in terms of generating impetus for domestic reform. The problem is that with the first decade of Japanese FTA policy, when you're negotiating with small trading partners and with developing nations who are more dependent on Japan than vice versa, these are not the counterparts that will help you generate that pressure to move along painful domestic reform. Right? Only an agreement of the magnitude of the TPP can act as that leverage. And therefore, that's why now there is this concern that if Japan misses out the TPP, also the cause of domestic reform will falter. Now, what are the difficulties? Well, and this is where it gets really complicated. There's a strong rationale for Japan to be in TPP, but the domestic politics are not conducive to that. And I always like to tell my students that trade politics are really an extension of domestic politics. They're joined at the hip. So what can a country negotiate is very much determined by its own internal constraints. And the picture is not pretty in Japan. Why? Well, first of all, in terms of the political climate, it has been very difficult because there has been a revolving door for prime ministers, right? Political instability at the top undermines the credibility of Japan as a negotiation partner, because who is going to take on Japan? Who's going to bring on Japan to the TPP when you don't know how long Prime Minister Noda is going to be in power, right? And after Noda, who comes next? The next Prime Minister is going to be as supportive of TPP or not? That's a very big open question. Another problematic fact is that the main parties in Japan, the LDP and the DPJ, have been divided on the issue of the TPP. So it's very difficult to present cohesive party platforms as to what is the future of the TPP and what is the future of key reforms in Japan. And the fact is that the political class in Japan today is consumed with a domestic battle about the consumption tax. And there's quite simply no political capital left to invest in the TPP at this point. That battle has to be fought first, and from what happens with that battle, we'll see what can be the future for the TPP. It's also true that the opponents of the TPP in Japan have mobilized forcefully. And from a point of view of people that study Japan, these are interesting times because a lot has changed in Japan, and the patterns of opposition have also switched too. It's not just that the agricultural cooperatives are mobilizing to oppose the TPP because they feel that it damages their concerns. It's a broader coalition. The Medical Association has also come out against the TPP. You also have some consumer groups that have come out against the TPP. And this coalition has put together a broader line of criticism of the TPP, saying that it undermines key social institutions, social and economic institutions of Japan. These are the so-called TPP ghosts. And this is the climate with which Japan is dealing, as it has now started the consultation process in trying to join the TPP. So the domestic landscape does not really signal to the TPP members that Japan has the consensus necessary to be part of this very ambitious trade negotiation. And now it has come to the point in time when Japan and the United States are discussing this negotiation. Japan has already won the support of 6 of the existing TPP members. Pending are Australia, New Zealand, and the United States. But if you talk to Japanese trade officials, they'll tell you that it really is about the United States. That if the United States gives the green light to Japan to come on board the TPP, this will indeed happen. And I would make the case that it has opened a very delicate period in US-Japan relations. These preliminary accession clause talks have to be handled with great care. Because, first of all, take into account that these 2 countries, Japan and the United States, are coming from very different places. How they look at these talks is different. From a point of view of the United States, this is about getting from Japan confidence-building measures that Japan is ready to undertake this unprecedented level of liberalization. And from the point of view of the USTR, you need this because there are a lot of skeptical voices in Congress and because a lot of American industry also is not very, very happy, some sectors in particular. From a point of view of Japan, these are seen as down payments of unilateral concessions that Japan must make before it has access to the bargaining process of the TPP. So Japanese trade negotiators also come with great constraints because the way in which the opponents of the TPP have manipulated these discussions and have made the case that Japan is subject to American pressure and that should be avoided. So this is not a very easy climate to move around. There are 3 main issues that have dominated these consultations: beef, postal insurance, and automobiles. And in particular, the automobile sector has been very negative towards the possible participation of Japan. It has stated, for example, that if Japan were to join, they might reconsider their support of the TPP overall. This is a special year as well. There's going to be elections in the United States in the fall. It is not an easy year either for the Obama administration to get into a fight with the car companies over Japan's participation in the TPP. And the question then becomes, when will Japan come in? Timing is very important because the longer it takes for Japan to join, the less likely it will actually have input in the negotiation. And again, talking to Japanese trade officials, they'll tell you that if Japan does not come on board in time to be one of the founding members, that could potentially be a deal breaker for Japan because Japan needs to have a say in this trade agreement, also to gather domestic support for this agreement. So in closing, I think I've gone too long. Let me just highlight how the outcome of Japan's TPP membership may actually also have great implications for Japan's regional diplomacy. And in a nutshell, let me just say that to me, this notion that Japan must choose between East Asia integration or Asia-Pacific integration is a false dichotomy. Japan should pursue both. It's in its best interest to be active in East Asia, negotiating free trade agreements and also seeking TPP membership. And that in fact, Japan's regional diplomacy will be aided if Japan has the TPP card in its hand. Let me tell you some examples why I think this is the case. When Prime Minister Noda finally made the announcement it would initiate the consultation process, he said, chemical reactions will take place, and they did happen. Countries in the region reacted promptly to the possibility that Japan would be in the TPP. One of the most dramatic moves was, for example, that China accelerated the trilateral China-Japan-Korea FTA. The joint study was supposed to go for 1 more year, and China sought to wrap up that sooner so that this trilateral FTA could be negotiated earlier. ASEAN also rolled out a new initiative, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is now known as the ASEAN Plus, which basically means that in order to break the stalemate between the ASEAN +3 and the ASEAN +6 initiatives, it has now adopted a new approach where the +6 countries can choose to apply to negotiate these trade, to participate in this new trade negotiation. And from the point of view of ASEAN, this is also very helpful because it maintains ASEAN's centrality in deciding who partakes in these negotiations. But as the TPP accession talks have taken much longer, as the prospects do not look so bright at some points, I think that Japan has lost leverage. And the fact that Korea decided to negotiate first with China, and the fact that there's only this vague commitment to start the trilateral negotiations at the end of this year was a very large blow for Japan. So in closing, let me just reiterate that I think that this is a critical juncture for Japan, because Japan has, for the first time, a real opportunity to negotiate with its main trade partners, the United States, the European Union, China, Korea. A few years back, these were not very likely options. They're now within reach. But these domestic constraints, if there's nothing that's done to address them, they could prevent Japan from being assertive in its trade policy. And if Japan misses out on the TPP vote, if the trilateral FTA does not start quickly or drags on for very long, I think then that this concern with marginalization could be back with us. Thank you very much.
Don't look at that. Okay. Hi, Derek Scissors Heritage. Sorry I'm late. There was a late-breaking congressional demand. They get cranky as summer approaches. All right. I'm going to make some remarks as if I know all of China's best interests. That is not a generally good idea. It is a better idea for me, in particular, on the econ side. I do tend to know what the Chinese think their interests are economically. As we venture into politics, which is relevant, I'm not denying it's relevant, I don't have as good a sense, so I'm going to try to stay away from that. If you're wondering how I could say something, think about it from a purely economic perspective. We can talk about the politics in Q&A, perfectly happy to do it, but my strength is on the econ side. I've been studying the Chinese economy for 20 years. I try not to study Chinese politics as much as I possibly can. All right. So here's the punchline. The punchline here is Northeast Asia is not economically very appealing to China. I know politically that doesn't make any sense. Economically, it does. Notwithstanding all the talk, which is mostly political, most of the partners in Northeast Asia are just not that interesting. China will want to be active, will want to be seen as being active, but it probably is not going to be worried about making too little progress. That's not going to be considered a failure. It's going to be considered a natural outcome in what is really a low priority area for progress. I don't mean to imply that China wants to roll back trade relations in Northeast Asia to 1975. I just mean that in terms of moving them forward, they're not that interested. And I'll explain why by going by country with a few remarks. We have to start with some China economics background. I'm a long-time bear, starting back from when the current government, which is about to leave, took over and in my opinion, well documented, moved away from market reform and towards statism. I started saying that in 2003. It started to be popular in 2009, but in fact started in 2003. We have a current bout of weakness in the Chinese economy. I don't think it's that interesting. I think it's just cyclical. I think structural weakness is a few years away. So the fact that it's very popular to be a China economics bear right now, don't be misled by that. The real challenge for China is going to come when they switch from continuing labor surplus to labor balance. It's going to happen very quickly, and their investment returns are already falling, so the dual challenge of labor and capital. When that happens, which you haven't got there yet in my opinion, China's going to have a choice of reform or stagnate. One of the reasons you're seeing a reform push now with the World Bank article and some other report and some other things is that there's a transition year. In 1992, Deng Xiaoping launched the Southern Tour. China returned to reform after Tiananmen. In 2002, we got this government, which is not a reforming government. Sometimes Premier Wen is characterized as the leader in the reform camp, which is just hysterical. It would be like talking about George Bush being the leader in the tax increase camp. This government could change things. Not that it will, but it could, and everybody realizes this, which is why you're getting more open political battles over economic direction. China doesn't need to reform today in order to save itself. It does need to reform in the next 5 years. If it stays on the state path, it will stagnate. And the collapse scenario is very unlikely. It would require some political events. On the economic side, it's very unlikely. But China will stagnate. It will stop growing. 2018, 2019, it's not imminent. But reform processes don't happen overnight either. So you don't want to wait till the last minute. That happens. That's what countries often do. They have a crisis and they finally get the nerve up to do something about it. Certainly India has that pattern, and China as well. But ideally, they would start the reform process now. They would go back to the slow liberalization that Deng Xiaoping authored, and then they would avoid the stagnation. If China does go back to reform, it's going to become more efficient as well as very big. You know, China was becoming more efficient when it was small. Now it's big. I would say overweight would be a better description. That kind of competitive challenge is going to have implications for the whole world. In particular, it's going to have implications for Korea and Japan, and it might spur greater cooperation than we think possible now. We're really not seeing China become nearly as competitive as it could be. I know that people have difficulty believing that, but right now China's competition is based on unlimited supplies of capital for large state-owned enterprises. That isn't going to work on a broad basis. So a really competitive, a really reforming China is going to change the environment for Korea and Japan. On the other hand, a stagnating China means that all this growth that the rest of Asia has been getting out about participating in a supply chain where China is the assembly process, it's going to go away. Right? So that source of growth for Japan, Korea, for the rest of Asia is going to stagnate. It's not going to stagnate tomorrow. It's not going to stagnate, next year. But it is going to stagnate unless China changes its economic policies, which I think they will. It's a question of when. So on the China stagnation side, you have a lot more pressure on Korea and Japan in a different way, which is to support their own growth, right? Rather than looking to someone else to pull them up, which is, in my opinion, Japan is more guilty of than Korea. Recently, we've had a development on the China-Japan relationship. They started currency trading. The Chinese have set the stage for having a real currency, but they haven't done the two important things, which is to open their bond market and to allow capital exit. Until that one of those two things or both of those two things is done, this is all theatrics. It's all, what if we had a real currency? Wouldn't this be meaningful? Well, you don't. You're still pegged to the dollar. The yuan is just a front for the dollar. So when you have yuan-yen trading, you have dollar-yen trading, only we have a derivative for it. And if we want to talk about currency, I can. Some people find it confusing, like my students at GW. But it's actually easy to explain. The yuan is now just the dollar internationally. Okay, it still is. The peg that we use changes, but the amount of fluctuation is so tiny that basically yuan-yen trading is just dollar-yen trading, so we don't care. Now, if China actually reformed its currency, which it's not doing yet, then this trading could be important. And this gets back to, is China going to reform or is it going to stagnate? All right, the trilateral, the China, Japan, Korea trilateral. There are people in this room who know more about domestic Japanese politics than me. Certainly, I'll just take the observation that Japan doesn't join real economic agreements. Unless it's forced, I guess would be the only outcome. And China, Korea are not enough to force Japan to do anything. All right, so we're not going to get a real China, Japan, Korea trilateral unless something happens to force Japan to join it. And I don't see that at the moment. It's possible. I just don't see it right now. You need to push from somewhere else. China, on the other hand, loves fake agreements. They love fake trade agreements, right? It's a diplomatic gain, and it even has a trade implication, which is China likes the direction of the global trading system now. So if you have an agreement that protects that existing direction, fine. It's not liberalizing. It doesn't change things. It's not efficient. But it's not real. It's not what we would call, as my colleague just talked about with TPP, a real trade agreement. But it protects the status quo to some extent, and it's a nice diplomatic coup. So Japan isn't prepared to have a real agreement. China doesn't really care about having a real agreement, probably doesn't want one. So the way you get a trilateral out of this is Korea goes along and says, okay, we won't have a real agreement either. Hooray. Now we all agree we're going to have another fake trade agreement. We got lots of those around. There are people in the room who might be offended by that characterization. Most of the agreements assigned in the last 5 years are fake. They're diplomatic or political or whatever. And again, that may be important to some people, not particularly important to me. I'm not going to argue that they're not politically important. They're not economically important. All right, so what about a China-Korea bilat? I actually think this will happen. Again, at KAI, I'm probably 50th in the room in knowing about this. But I had Korean colleagues in the government say right on 4 or 5 years ago, we want to sign the agreement with the U.S., which of course was supposed to come before the agreement with the EU, a little problem on the American side for that. Then we want to sign an agreement with the EU, and then we want to sign an agreement with China. Well, the chorus is a real agreement. It's not perfect, but it's a real agreement. The agreement with the EU is a real agreement. I think Korea is now in a position to be willing to sign a real agreement with China, not just a fake agreement. They wouldn't have done it 5 years ago. Ordering was important. The ordering has been taken care of. Now they can. So that's my amateur, but some conversations view of the Korean situation. The Chinese situation is a little different. As I said, China likes market ratifying agreements rather than market opening agreements. They like agreements that protect what they have. That's the goal. Right? So if China feels like Chorus and the EU agreement, they're gonna pull Korea away from us. We're gonna lose access to Korean markets. We're at a competitive disadvantage now. They're gonna want to restore the status quo. That's how far they're gonna want to go in the agreement. So then the question is, what does Korea want to? How hard does Korea want to push? Does Korea really want to have an agreement with China comparable to Chorus? That might make you a little uncomfortable. The U.S. runs the world's biggest current account deficits. China runs the world's biggest current account surpluses. It's not like you can look at the two and say, well, they're both big, so we can have the same agreement. No. All right. So China's going to want to restore the status quo. If to go beyond that, I think you're going to have to pull the Chinese, which Korea can do to some extent, but then Korea has to decide how far do we want to pull China into a liberalizing agreement? Do we really want to have a mutual opening of markets with an established trade predator that has a lot more control of its enterprises than we do? My prediction is we're going to get Chorus light. They'll finesse some issues that were forced to some extent in Chorus. And, the usual, it'll have Sino-Korean characteristics, and everything you talk about China, you always say X with Chinese characteristics. Well, X with Chinese and Korean characteristics. I think there'll be more emphasis on supply chain integration, trying to get things out of the way so that the supply chain routing through China and Korea can be moved smoother, and more things taken off the table, obviously, in agriculture. I think the interesting part of the possible bilateral is whether, for political reasons, China will offer anything surprising. Right? Whether they're just going to do the same thing they always do, which is important in this case, just try to catch up to their competitors in the Korean market by moving back to the status quo pre-Chorus and pre-EU agreement, or they're actually going to do more. There's going to be a strategic element of this, and that's a difficult question. One thing we're not going to get is the Chinese are not going to make any sort of interesting decision now, because they have a political transition, and until that's settled and somebody is actually in charge of these sorts of decisions in a clear way, we're not going to get a major Chinese initiative. But depending on the timing, we could get one. I wouldn't bet on it, but it's possible in 2013. All right, that's what we're here to talk about. But I want to also talk about Russia, North Korea, and Mongolia quickly, because I know you guys are bored. I won't spend as much time on that. We're now in the midst of another round of China-Russia friendship, and the world power is shifting, and it's multipolar, and all this nonsense. We've had these every few years for 15 years. Okay, the core of the China-Russia relationship should be energy trade, and they can't come to any long-term energy deals. And they've tried and tried and tried. They always fail. And it always comes back to the fact that if you don't come to a long-term energy deal, when prices are low, China wants to import more, and prices are higher, Russia wants to export more. You've got to have a long-term deal to deal with price fluctuations. Well, the Russians don't trust the Chinese, so they won't sign the deal. So they just pretend to sign the deal. We're going to hear it now. We're in the midst of it now. Oh, Putin loves China, and they're getting together against the U.S., and then 3 years we'll hold the same thing. And there's no change in their relationship at all. China, North Korea. It's very difficult to talk about the North Korea-China relationship because North Korea doesn't actually have any money. So when we talk, or property rights. So when we talk about Chinese investment in North Korea, one of the things Heritage does is we have a tracker on Chinese outward investment all around the world. And we basically have a placeholder for North Korea, because I don't have any idea how much China has spent in North Korea, because it's not clear they're actually spending anything. And it's not clear what they get. Investment is supposed to have ownership. Do they own a mine in North Korea, or are they just sort of there? And what are the terms of the agreement? North Korea has no commercial law system. So it's very difficult to quantify the relationship. It's obviously important to North Korea. It is not at all important to China economically. If North Korea were to move down the economic reform path, including under the brutal dictatorship, but economic reform path, which the Chinese have been trying to get them to move down for 20 years. If North Korea would have moved down the economic reform path, the Chinese are going to try to get them into every trade agreement they can. All right, they're going to try to support that internationally in every way possible. So, you all are following North Korea more closely. Maybe you put the odds of economic reform at 1 in 50. I think it's a little higher than that, but it's not high. My point is, if and when it happens, China will be pulling North Korea to all these meetings. Here's my friend. Include them. And we might actually want to encourage that, depending on the situation in North Korea. It's not going to be easy, because again, no property rights, no money, real money, it's all barter, etc. But that's the China-North Korea relationship. China-Mongolia I want to talk about because you can make an argument that Mongolia is more important to China than Korea and Japan. Now, obviously, on trade volumes, that's absurd. Okay? But on growth of economic prospects, not the status quo, where clearly there's no comparison, but growth of economic prospects, it's not so clear. Mongolia has coal, iron, things that Korea and Japan don't have. They don't compete with China in almost anything. That's always a plus. From the Chinese standpoint. If you take away finance, Chinese investment in Mongolia in the last few years is higher than Chinese investment in Japan and Korea. And finance is a big exception. But in terms of what you're adding to the relationship, not where the relationship is now, China might be more interested in Mongolia. That's a controversial statement, but I will stick by it to some extent. I'm almost done. I have one more minute and we'll be finished, and you can ask questions or yell, as the case may be. Korea. China would like a bilateral with Korea to restore the pre-Chorus EU status quo in terms of competitive standards. It would love to expand its relationship with Mongolia. The Mongolians are pretty hesitant about this. They're playing games with the Russians and actually with the Americans too, to try to balance everything off. I don't think China, and maybe my own personal prejudices are getting in here, is really amped up to sign a real agreement with Japan, because I think the odds of that are zero. Even if Japan were able to do it, China wouldn't do it. So I think that's all political theater. Russia is established political theater, has been going on for a long time. Nothing ever actually happens. They could do this, they could do that, they never do. And the North Korea is premature. So that's just not a lot. We've gone through the whole region now. There's just not that much there. There's a status quo restoring bilateral with South Korea, and there's as much investment as Mongolia will tolerate. And that's really all I see the Chinese looking for in the area. Thanks. All of us up here? Okay.
Well, I think we had a fascinating panel talking about the region, talking about Korea, Japan, and China, and the region as a whole. So we have a few minutes for questions, so we'll take the first question. Please raise your hand, state your name and affiliation if you can, and there'll be a microphone coming around. So, gentleman right there.
Hello. My name is Chris Peterson. I'm with American University, and this question is for Mr. Scissors. You mentioned that you didn't think that there would be any real agreement that could come between China and Japan. But one of the difficulties that Japan has, they haven't really been willing to work on is agricultural. And one of the areas that China is really seeking to develop is moving up the value chain with high technology. I was wondering if you could comment on that sector kind of being a basis for Japanese-Chinese relations.
Okay, I have no idea what this is. It looks really like a lipstick applicator.
If you just set it out on the table, it'll pick up.
There already is considerable high-tech integration between Japan and China. So, all of my remarks should be considered forward-looking, just because that's what I think economists are supposed to do, not tell you what has already happened. So, yes, it's not like we're at a standing start. There is considerable integration between Japan and China on the technology side. There isn't going to be on the agricultural side, so you can make an argument, okay, well, agriculture can be taken off the table in Japan-China negotiations, and doesn't that make everything easier? I suppose. But what are you going to add? Who's going to give up what? Is Japan in this situation willing to allow open competition in the Japanese market with Chinese firms moving up the ladder? No. The Chinese don't allow competition among their own firms. They're certainly not going to allow competition among foreign firms. So we have, you're right, if you just look at the endowments of the two countries and then taking agriculture off the table, you could say, well, they fit together. I can see some gains here. I'm not disagreeing with you there. But in terms of the actual policy stances of the two countries, you don't see it. You just see a lot of talk about how we could get gains here. We're actually willing to tolerate what would be required. And again, I know the Chinese side better than the Japanese side. The Japanese side is just, okay, where's the agreement? Where's the precedent? Don't have one. Chinese side, we have their entire policy direction over 10 years says, we don't like competition.
Next question right there.
Thank you. Akira Chiba of the Japanese Embassy. Hello? The Japanese government used to have a policy of sticking to the WTO when it comes to trade issues, but in the face of growing FTAs, we have shifted here to have a WTO and free trade agreements in tandem. So the question that I'm going to ask to Dr. Solis might not sound very much in tandem with our policy. That is to say, when we face a free trade agreement or EPAs or any sort of bilateral, trilateral trade agreements, there seems to be a dichotomy between either joining it or going down the drain. But there seems to be a third alternative, that is to circumvent what's going on. I think Mr. Meltzer hinted at the secret of when we look at trade volume figures, it might not reflect the real flow of goods because it might be the same thing going around, and the figures don't tell us what's going on in the real world. So probably we can remember when the Great East Japan earthquake happened, people started worrying about we don't get our new iPhones because most of the parts come from Japan. Well, it didn't happen, but that shows that trade volume doesn't really reflect the real aspect of what's going on the ground. For example, we don't see much Toyotas or Hondas running around in Seoul because of the high tariff, but we are going to see that probably in the future because Toyotas and Hondas are now American cars built in the USA, and because of our cars, we will have Japanese cars. Well, not Japanese, but American cars, which are Hondas and Toyotas running around in Seoul. So this is one way of circumventing free trade agreements and joining the wagon without even signing an agreement. So the question is, and I'm heartened by Dr. Scissors' how should I say, posture, that there might be a reason that countries are not interested in joining free trade agreements because they can make money anyway. So how would you argue that free trade is the only solution?
Just speak to
Okay, that's a very interesting question. It's true that there is, and going back to what Mr. Scissors was referring to, there's already a significant amount of de facto integration, and the fact that these production networks have spread throughout, and Japan accomplished that prior to the FTA movement. So clearly Japan has already a presence in those markets. But the fact is that still many Japanese businesses feel disadvantaged when other countries do negotiate these free trade agreements, because there is a key difference between what happens as an exercise in liberalization at the WTO level and what happens with these free trade agreements, because they extend preferences only to members. Not every free trade agreement out there creates a competitive disadvantage for Japanese companies. That also is not accurate. But there are some, especially as Mr. Meltzer was referring to, the Korea-EU, for example, that the Japanese electronics industry has highlighted as one that does create a competitive disadvantage. So in that case, not being on par with what other countries are doing does hurt Japan. And that's just on the economic side. I also fully concur that these free trade agreements are proliferating like wildfire, not necessarily because of the economic benefits, but because they're seen as exercises in political diplomacy. So the fact that Japan is seen as lagging behind, the fact that Japan cannot come to the table, hurts Japanese diplomacy, I would argue. So I think that it's the economic rationale of some FTAs that do create investment diversion. It is the fact that given that the WTO is facing a stagnation, quite frankly, the Doha round is not coming to a conclusion, these become the venue to generate a new batch of trade and investment rules. And also it's the fact that Japan wants to be seen as a country active in its diplomacy in the region.
We'll go back there, and then Mr. Warren. Middle, right there. Mm-hmm.
Hi, Clark Quigley with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Just building off of what was just said from Ms. Solis, then if the Korea-EU trade agreement is one that is, in a sense, left Japan behind, do you think that the TPP poses a realistic threat of economically doing the same if Japan does not become involved in the negotiations? And can you highlight some examples, sectors that you think would be most vulnerable?
Well, yeah. I mean, if Japan does not join the TPP, that's going to create a big disadvantage. Also, because keep in mind that the EU, Japan had been asking the EU to negotiate a free trade agreement so that it could balance the playing field vis-a-vis Korean companies. And the EU was, quite frankly, very reluctant. They did not see any benefit to negotiate a free trade agreement. They wanted to talk about regulatory harmonization, addressing non-tariff barriers, but not in the setting of a free trade agreement. It was only when Japan began to actively think about the TPP that the Europeans also then came on board saying we'll go forward with a trade agreement. So just through that effect of Japan joining the TPP, it actually opened a possible negotiation upfront with the Europeans. So that's a net benefit. If Japan does not participate in the TPP, actually the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry released some figures that there would be a major loss, and I can't remember exactly the industries, but clearly it's the usual industries that have very a strong international presence, electronics, automobiles, equipment, all those industries, because Japan would not partake in these important negotiations.
Can I just add to that? Because I think something that's worth mentioning is, I think the point about circumvention and the way countries use options to invest rather than trade is important. But, it's an interesting question to ask because, the process that's been going on in Japan for, a decade at least now is what has been referred to as hollowing out of industry. And, it's going to be interesting to see if, in fact, industry and the Kaidan-ren in particular, as representative of basically Japanese industry in Japan, realises that they're going to make no progress whatsoever in getting the Japanese government to move on FTAs. And so industry essentially starts focusing on investing increasingly in countries that do have FTAs with their key trading partners. And I don't know how that plays out politically, whether in fact you lose this sort of voice for reform in Japan, which essentially has been Japanese industry up until now, and they eventually conclude that it's not worth the effort any longer, and they focus on moving industry increasingly outside of Japan. And this, I think, gets to this other key issue, which is that, yes, Japan's always focused on the WTO, because I think, in a sense, there's been a view that only the WTO can actually drive the type of reform that is needed in Japan. And, if you don't have the WTO, the next best thing is an FTA with the United States, because that's big enough to drive reform. And reform is crucial. Japan is suffering so many challenges. So it would be a real pity, I think, if in fact, this series of FTAs which is now underway actually sort of undermined or lessened the reform voice in Japan, particularly coming from industry, because they were able to circumvent in the way you've been talking about.
Mr. Warren?
Rob Warren, .org. I'd like to go back to an issue that you really haven't addressed, and that is whether the TPP has the political support in the United States. We don't have trade promotion authority today. We have an election coming up. Can we really undertake a broad-based liberalizing reform in the next year or two?
Can I start with that, since I was just talking about it? Not here. Obviously it's not going to happen this year. There isn't anything to, the chapter summaries are supposed to come up at USTR shortly, so we can actually talk about them publicly. But they said that a little while ago too. But 2013, so clearly the election matters. I would say right now, if somehow magically we got the exact same Congress, Democratic control of the Senate, Republican control of the House, and nobody left to go in a new administration, I think there's a pretty good chance. Obviously, it will depend on the details of an agreement that haven't all been worked out or presented, so you're going to get some pushback when the details are presented no matter what. We were left out, this is too much, goes without saying. But sorry, this is going to sound partisan. It's not meant to be. This is just a trade observation about U.S. politics. The only group that looks strongly opposed to this is House Democrats. If you have the House remaining in Republican hands and the Senate remaining in Democratic hands, I think Congress is cooperative. Now, there is this possibility of somebody poisoning the waters, the White House does something that the Congress doesn't like, and then there's all this retaliation. The number of times you hear members saying things like, stop talking to me about this issue. I'm mad at the administration, that's why I'm acting this way. Okay, that's fantastic. Not really very helpful. I don't know why you want to talk to an expert on an issue when you don't care about the issue. That's always possible. But right now, the leadership in both houses is very pro-TPP. They see it as, the Obama administration has walked away from the WTO. There's a lot of frustration with dealing with not like-minded countries, and they see the TPP as this magic solution. I think a danger is going to be, as one of my colleagues pointed out, when we find out the TPP isn't perfect. But if I had to bet right now, I'd say you put a TPP agreement up and it goes through the Congress.
Can I just add to that quickly? I mean, I think if you look at the resources that the administration is now throwing at the TPP, that it is undoubtedly clear that there is a very serious commitment on the side of the administration to doing as much as they can on the TPP this year. I mean, I completely agree that you're not going to get a TPP deal done this year, just even purely from a negotiating perspective, putting aside the difficulties of actually moving it through Congress. On the TPA front, I mean, I think it's an interesting question, but the perspective of USTR seems to be they'll ask for TPA, you know, when they need it, and you may in fact find that you now get a different type of TPA than we've seen in the past, which is really focused on, say, for instance, TPP specifically. I mean, certainly the administration is behaving as if they have TPA in the sense that the way they interact with Congress. I don't think that when it comes to it, that will be a stumbling block.
I actually am not as optimistic. I'm going to be the dissenting voice here a little bit. I've written in the past, I do think that the U.S., you know, people when they talk about Japan, they say Japan has a credibility issue. I think the United States has a credibility issue, not only because it does not have trade promotion authority, but because it has put through a lot of pain. You know, Korea, Panama, Colombia went through a lot and had to renegotiate, and it was politically very painful to do this. So if I was a country looking at what it's like to negotiate with the United States and the complicated politics of Congress, and the fact that you have an agreement that's going to perhaps talk about sugar, dairy, textiles, I mean, there's going to be an ugly fight. And increasingly, the climate has become polarized. Trade agreements are judged in terms of their export promotion, job creation potential. So, you know, it can be complicated. And I think that if I was a counterpart to the TPP at the table, I would be thinking, will the U.S. at the end of the day deliver on all these issues or not?
Mr. Lim, and then we'll take the last question, Andrew, in the back.
My name is Jusamli from Korean Embassy. My question goes to Mr. Caesars. When you talked about the economic reform in China within 5 years, it cannot be next years, but can they seek the driving force of their domestic economic reform from FTAs or from outside? If we can take some examples in Korea or Japan, Korea did conclude FTA with the United States. That could be a clear source of reform. And as Ms. Solis talked about, Japan would like to seek domestic reform thanks to the TPP. So if...
Yeah, the answer is absolutely yes, but the extent is in question. So we're already doing this on currency. The way the financial reform community is selling currency liberalization in China is as a nationalist tool. Right? We're going to be a great power. We have to have our own currency. Therefore, we have to move off the dollar. So they already use, obviously the WTO was a huge factor in Chinese reform, WTO negotiations more than the actual accession. So we have precedent. It's going on right now with regard to currency. But the question is what agreement? A China-Korea-Japan agreement is not big enough from the Chinese standpoint to push reform. And that's not a reason, okay, we have to make these changes to get an agreement with Japan and Korea. No one's going to respond to that. It would have to be a new round of the WTO, which, you know, maybe a new administration changes that, I don't know. I'm not too optimistic. Or it has to be something like TPP is seen as a competitive threat. You know, one of the ways, when I talk to members and they talk about how do we get the Chinese to move to this reform path, say a successful TPP, not just a vacuous TPP. Look, we have lots of countries and we avoided all the hard issues. And we can already do that. A successful TPP is big enough for the Chinese to feel like we have to change. Not necessarily we're going to join because there's some political back and forth there. They may not want, but we have to do something to counter TPP. We have to you know, break the policy stagnation we've fallen into, which is respond to every problem with more bank lending. So I think you do have external events pushing the reform process in China helpfully, but China's big, and they need something big to really make a difference in the overall fight of, you know, continue toward the state or move back to the market. The WTO was more than enough in the late 90s. China's bigger now. The WTO is moribund. I don't know what's going to be bigger, what's going to be big enough other than a successful expanding TPP, which I agree with my colleagues is certainly not at all guaranteed. So there's some possibility there, but that doesn't mean it will actually happen.
We'll tie the last two questions in the back, and then the panel can answer both.
Hi, Andrew Yo, Assistant Professor at Catholic University. This question is directed to the first two panelists. So when talking about Northeast Asia, it's we often distinguish between security and economic issues. And so in the first, well, in distinguishing these two, most people tend to be more optimistic about economics and trade in Northeast Asia than security. But I'm wondering, to what extent do security issues hinder or become a stumbling block for some of these economic agreements, particularly the Korea-Japan-China FTA discussions?
And we'll take that last question. Right there, in the middle.
Thank you, Jerry Park, visiting fellow at CSIS. Two quick things. First thing is about Mr. Meltzer's briefing on the Korean situations. I would like to just emphasize that it's not just about China. It's more about East Asia, who's having a big stake in Korean trade. Not just China and Japan. I'm talking about the ASEAN, and like EU 27 and US. Japan, which accounts respectively around 100 billion US dollars, ASEAN accounted for 120 billion US dollars last year. So it's all about East Asia, I believe. And second thing is question about the future prospect of this regional FTAs to Dr. Solis. I fully agree with your assertion that it's wrong and forced dichotomy between East Asia versus Asia Pacific, but the true, the reality, practicality is there have been lots of ideas like ASEAN Plus 3 EAFTA, ASEAN Plus 6 CEPIA, and at one time China and Japan joint proposal for economic integration, and now on TPP and trilateral. So all these ideas and proposals, do you believe it will be negotiated successfully in the coming near future? Thank you.
Anyone can address first.
I think the overlay between the security and the economic questions are clearly important. I mean, it depends what you mean by the security issues, because I think there's the Korean Peninsula issue, and then I think there's clearly a broader dynamic about what China means for security in that region. I think the way the economic issues cut across a multiple. I mean, in a sense, I think that at one level there's a view that it's a little bit like what really, the way people thought about trade, I think, in the European context following World War II, in the sense that, the closer you sort of pull these economies together, the less likely you might find sort of the security frictions rising to, a point where they're going to actually become hot and go to war with each other. And so, and that's also at a more sort of subtle level, I guess, about using trade now very much as a vehicle for reform, which we've been talking a lot about today. And I think in a sense that, the TPP and what's going on with ASEAN is certainly, a very key part of that, because, up until I think China's accession to the WTO, clearly that was like the key vehicle for driving economic reform in China. When you think about China's certainly not been on the reform path in the last 10 years, and there is this very important question about whether China's actually going to reform in the type of way that would be best for itself and also best globally. And this obviously is also not only about making sure that China's economy develops in the way that is beneficial for everyone, but also will play out in terms of the politics in China and ultimately then around regional security issues. In a sense, the concern I think probably at the moment is that in the absence of the WTO as a key driver for that you end up in a form of regionalism, which is possibly a situation which actually creates tensions rather than lessens them. And certainly, if you end up with blocks, say for instance in Asia and maybe in South America and Europe, which actually don't talk to each other that well, that's a possible outcome. So in a sense, the TPP, I think, can also be seen as a vehicle which sort of moves a, say, Northeast, Southeast Asia focus to one which is more Asia-Pacific in scope and particularly includes the United States. And so in that sense, tries to break down that type of regionalism. And also importantly, is done in a way which includes the type of openness and the type of rules that WTO plus and are seen as the type of vehicles which would, hopefully, if China sort of buys onto this at the end of the day, would move the Chinese economy in the reform direction that you would like to see to go. Now, you know, what that means politically and what that means in a security sense is certainly hard to predict, but I think that is certainly the trajectory which is considered the best way to go.
Okay, just 1 minute because I know that time is up and everybody has things to get to. On the security trade nexus, can the free trade agreements help overcome the security mistrust and so forth in Northeast Asia that's kept these countries apart? I don't think so. I mean, and I actually have paid attention, for example, to the earlier negotiations, bilateral negotiations between Japan and Korea. And those negotiations first came apart not because of these historical animosities and all these issues, but based on the market access disagreements. But what happened was that once you had that deadlock in the negotiation, they couldn't go up to the next political level at the top leadership because the climate of bilateral relations was very, very bad. So I do think that you cannot use the FTAs to sort of compensate for these broader lingering territorial historical issues. And the other question about whether I'm optimistic that this regional architecture will materialize and that Japan can use the TPP to advance its diplomacy, you must know that academics are loath to make any predictions, especially if we're bound to be proven wrong in the short-term future. I don't know if these agreements can materialize, and more importantly, I'm skeptical that absent the TPP, Japan's membership in TPP, that they can be of substance, because I think that Japan cannot really gain traction in demanding more in the area of rules if it does not become if it doesn't have that credibility of having that other open negotiation front. So one thing is they can negotiate any kind of agreement, as we've heard, but will they actually make a difference in terms of being substantial? That is a key issue. But I do think that it helps Japan to have these concurrent fronts so that it can be more attractive as a potential partner. Thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you for coming and braving this rainy day. And I think that goes to tell you that this is a very timely and interesting topic. Thanks to our co-sponsors, Margot at Mansfield Foundation and Nick at CSI's Japan Chair. And most importantly, thanks to our speakers. So please join me in thanking them.